There was silence where voices should have been, and even the wind seemed to tread with care among the abandoned stones. "Welcome, my friend. I'm John, and I'm glad you've joined me beside the fading roads of Middle-earth. Tonight we will follow forgotten paths where old oaths, cold ashes, and hidden memories still linger beneath broken walls. Walk quietly, keep your eyes upon the shadows, and let the tale unfold one careful step at a time." The road that wound south from Isengard no longer carried the tramp of ordered companies or the rumble of war machines. Grass had begun to creep over the ruts where wheels once bit deep into the earth. Yet the land still bore the scars of fire, and blackened stumps stood where proud trees had fallen beneath the axes of orcs. Smoke no longer rose from furnaces, for the great pits had gone cold after the fall of the Dark Tower and the breaking of the White Wizard's strength. Ravens circled in the pale autumn sky, settling from time to time upon broken timbers as though they watched over a kingdom already forgotten. Through that silent country walked two figures whose shadows stretched long across the fading light, and neither of them spoke for many miles. Saruman's white robes had become stained with dust and ash until they seemed scarcely brighter than old stone. His staff was gone, broken by command of the head of his own order, and every step reminded him of the weight of that loss. Once he had crossed Middle-earth with kings rising to greet him, and servants hastening to obey his slightest word, but now even wandering crows scattered only because they disliked the sound of footsteps. Beside him trudged Grima Wormtongue, thin as a winter reed, his face hollow from hunger and long fear. He carried a worn sack across one shoulder, though it held little beyond a crust of stale bread, a dull knife, and a patched blanket that smelled of damp earth. Neither master nor servant wished to remember the day when the Ents had shattered the walls of Isengard. Saruman had watched his works drown beneath rushing waters, while those whom he had mocked strode through the flood untouched by fear. Later had come the greater ruin, when the One Ring perished and the power of Sauron dissolved into nothingness. In that same hour, Saruman had felt another wound, invisible yet sharper than steel, as the strength he had gathered through years of craft slipped beyond his reach. He never spoke of that pain, for pride would not allow the words, but it lingered within him, like an ember buried beneath cold ash. Toward evening they reached the remains of a burned hamlet standing beside a narrow stream. The cottages had long since collapsed, leaving only low walls of cracked stone and scorched beams half buried beneath weeds. Grima knelt beside the water and cupped his hands eagerly, drinking until his breath steadied, while Saruman remained standing with narrowed eyes upon the empty buildings. "Someone has slept here within the past fortnight," he said at last, his voice still smooth despite his hardship. Grima looked up sharply, seeing nothing until he noticed ashes beneath a fallen roof that had not yet been washed away by rain. The servant searched the ruins while Saruman watched the road with patient caution. Beneath loose stones, Grima found the bones of a goat, stripped clean, and a broken spear whose point had snapped against something harder than flesh. Fresh footprints marked the damp earth beyond the stream, though many had blurred beneath the wind. "Orcs?" Grima asked quietly, unable to hide the tremor in his voice, and Saruman shook his head after a long glance. "Men," he answered. "Desperate men, carrying poor weapons and little food. They fear pursuit more than battle." Night settled quickly across the valley, bringing with it a bitter wind from the mountains. Grima gathered fallen branches, while Saruman selected a sheltered corner behind the remains of a chimney where the fire would cast little light beyond the broken walls. Their meal consisted of a single rabbit snared by chance that afternoon, divided into portions so small that neither man felt satisfied. Grima gnawed the last scrap of meat from the bone and stared into the flames with tired eyes. Saruman ate more slowly, measuring every bite as though careful habits alone could preserve the dignity stripped from him by defeat. Silence lasted until the fire had burned low, and then Grima spoke without lifting his gaze. "Must we keep wandering like beggars?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion, though he seemed to regret the words as soon as they left his mouth. Saruman did not answer immediately, for anger came swiftly to him now, quicker than wisdom. At last he folded his hands within his sleeves and replied, "A beggar asks because he has no choice. I seek because I know where forgotten things lie." Grima frowned, uncertain whether those words concealed truth or only another promise that would never be fulfilled. Saruman reached into the inner fold of his robe and withdrew a small leather packet protected from weather by careful wrapping. Inside rested a narrow strip of parchment covered in faded writing and marked with a rough map drawn many years before. Grima leaned closer, recognizing the southern marches beyond Isengard, lands where scattered watchposts had once guarded hidden roads leading toward Dunland and farther east. A small circle had been inked beside the ruins of an old hill fortress abandoned before the War of the Ring. "One of my captains kept supplies there," Saruman said softly. "He obeyed instructions that even the masters of my armies never knew." Grima studied the map until the firelight danced across the faded ink. "If such a place exists," he murmured, "would it not have been plundered already?" Saruman smiled faintly, though warmth never reached his eyes. "Most thieves search where treasure is expected. The wise conceal valuables where fools see only ruin." His confidence sounded convincing, yet somewhere beneath it lay a thread of uncertainty that even he could not entirely silence. Too much had changed since the ring was destroyed, and many secrets buried before the war might now belong to strangers. Long after Grima had wrapped himself in the blanket and fallen into uneasy sleep, Saruman remained awake beneath the stars. The sky seemed strangely vast without the weight of his former ambitions, and the constellations shone with cold indifference upon victory and defeat alike. He listened to distant wolves calling across the hills and considered how swiftly power vanished when fear no longer upheld it. Yet the old hunger endured within him, refusing to yield, whispering that a single hidden storehouse, a handful of loyal servants, or one fortunate turn of chance might begin the slow climb back toward command. Before dawn, the sound of hooves carried faintly through the darkness, and Saruman's eyes opened at once. He stirred the dying fire until only grey ash remained, then nudged Grima awake without a word. Together they crouched among fallen stones, while 3 mounted riders crossed the stream beyond the ruined village. Their cloaks bore no badge, and their horses looked lean from hard travel, but each rider carried a spear and kept glancing over one shoulder, as though expecting pursuit. They passed without stopping, never guessing that 2 silent watchers measured every movement from the shadows. When the riders had vanished beyond the ridge, Saruman rose with slow deliberation and brushed dust from his sleeves. His gaze lingered upon the tracks left in the soft earth, reading them with the practiced eye of one who had long directed scouts and armies. "Others search these lands," he said quietly, almost to himself, and for the first time since leaving Isengard, a spark of purpose brightened his worn face. Grima shouldered the sack once more, though unease settled heavily in his heart, for he had learned that whenever hope awakened in Saruman, suffering was seldom far behind. Together they turned south into the empty wastelands, following a road that seemed forgotten by the world, unaware that unseen eyes had already begun to follow their trail. Morning came beneath a low ceiling of grey clouds that dulled the light and flattened every colour upon the land. The road soon dwindled into little more than a pair of faint wheel ruts, winding through rough heath, where thorn bushes clung stubbornly to patches of stony soil. To the west, the dark shoulders of the misty mountains stood distant and cold, while eastward, the country rolled away into broken hills scarred by abandoned quarries and forgotten charcoal pits. Few birds sang there, and those that did seemed quick to fall silent whenever the travellers approached. Saruman welcomed the silence, for it allowed him to hear the smallest sound beyond the wind, and years of command had sharpened that habit until it had become second nature. Grima struggled to match his master's pace as the ground rose steadily beneath their feet. Hunger had left his limbs weak, and the restless sleep of the previous night had done little to restore his strength. More than once he glanced behind them, uneasy without knowing why, yet each time the empty road stretched away beneath the dim sky without revealing another soul. Saruman noticed those backward looks, but offered neither comfort nor rebuke. He merely adjusted his course now and then, avoiding open ridges where distant watchers might mark two lonely figures against the horizon. By midday, they reached the ruins of an old watchtower, built in the days when the men of Gondor still guarded the northern frontiers. Time had split its upper walls, and ivy crawled over stones that no mason had touched for generations. Saruman circled the tower before entering, studying the ground with deliberate care, and his expression hardened when he found the marks he expected. Bootprints crossed the fallen threshold, some fresh, others blurred by recent rain, and several had been made by feet much larger than those of men. Grima crouched beside one deep impression and swallowed uneasily as he recognized the broad shape of an orc's heel. "There are not many," Saruman said, after counting the tracks. "A scouting band, perhaps 6 or 7, no more." Grima looked toward the dark doorway and tightened his grip upon the knife hanging at his belt. "That is enough," he answered quietly. "Enough to kill us both." Saruman regarded him with calm impatience before stepping inside the ruin as though entering a familiar hall. "Only if they find us first," he replied, his voice carrying the confidence of habit rather than certainty. Within the broken tower, little remained besides shattered beams and a staircase leading nowhere. Rain had pooled upon cracked flagstones, and the smell of damp moss filled the cool air beneath the roofless walls. Yet someone had searched the place not long before, overturning loose stones and prying open ancient storage pits that had long since yielded nothing of value. Saruman knelt beside one disturbed corner, running his fingers across the earth before lifting them to inspect the fine grains of dust. Whoever had searched there had been thorough, but they had departed disappointed. Grima wandered toward a narrow slit overlooking the southern hills, and suddenly stiffened. Far across the valley, scarcely visible through drifting mist, a thin column of smoke rose into the still air. It was no wildfire, for the smoke climbed in a steady line before spreading beneath the clouds. "A camp," he whispered. Saruman joined him and watched without speaking for several moments, measuring both distance and direction with careful eyes. "Not far from the road we seek," he murmured at last, and Grima could not decide whether the discovery pleased him or troubled him. They descended from the tower and left the road altogether, moving across rough country where scattered boulders offered concealment. Heather brushed against their boots, and loose stones shifted beneath every step, forcing them to walk more slowly than before. The wind freshened during the afternoon, carrying with it a sour odor, unlike wood smoke or damp earth. Grima wrinkled his nose and searched the hills ahead until he saw several dark shapes circling lazily above a distant ravine. Carrion birds had gathered there in unusual numbers, and Saruman altered their course without hesitation. The ravine held the remains of a skirmish fought no more than 3 days earlier. 3 dead men lay where they had fallen, stripped of cloaks, boots, and anything useful, while 2 orcs sprawled nearby with arrows protruding from their chests. Flies buzzed thickly despite the cool weather, and wolves had already begun their work upon the corpses. Grima turned away, pressing a sleeve across his mouth, but Saruman examined the ground with grim attention. Broken spear shafts, scattered feathers, and churned mud revealed a brief, violent struggle that had ended almost as quickly as it began. One of the dead men still wore a small bronze brooch, shaped like a running horse, hidden beneath his torn tunic where looters had failed to notice it. Saruman recognized the token at once, though he kept that knowledge to himself. Years before, scattered clans in Dunland had accepted gifts and promises from Isengard, swearing quiet service in return for weapons and protection. Many had perished during the war, yet some clearly remained upon these roads, still carrying signs of loyalties forged long ago. Whether they remembered those oaths with gratitude or bitterness was another matter entirely. Grima finally broke the silence as they climbed from the ravine. "If your old followers still wander these lands, why do they not seek you?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill wind. Saruman did not answer at once, and the delay itself revealed more than words might have done. "Because defeat teaches swift obedience to new masters," he said eventually. "Those who once bowed deeply learn to lower their eyes when fortune changes." He spoke with cold contempt, yet beneath it lingered an unspoken awareness that even loyalty had limits. Toward evening, they reached a line of low hills crowned with wind-bent pines. Saruman chose a narrow cleft between weathered rocks as their resting place, hidden from every obvious approach. While Grima gathered dry needles and broken branches for another small fire, Saruman climbed alone to the ridge above. From there he could see the distant smoke once more, now thicker than before, and tiny movements flickered around its base. Wagons stood within the camp, though only their outlines could be made out against the fading light, and armed figures passed between them with steady purpose. As darkness settled across the hills, another glow appeared several miles farther south, smaller than the first and strangely brief. It flared once, vanished, then returned after a measured pause before disappearing altogether. Saruman narrowed his eyes, recognizing the rhythm immediately. Signal fires. Not the beacons of Gondor, but simple field signs exchanged between hidden camps. Someone was coordinating movements across these wastelands, and that suggested discipline rather than mere banditry. Such order troubled him, for disciplined enemies were far harder to deceive than starving wanderers. Grima climbed beside him, carrying 2 strips of roasted rabbit, scarcely larger than a man's thumb. "You see something?" he said quietly, following Saruman's fixed gaze toward the southern horizon. The wizard accepted the meager food without looking away. "Yes," he answered after a long silence. "These lands are no longer empty. Someone gathers the scattered pieces left behind by the war." His voice remained calm, but his thoughts raced ahead through old memories of captains, hidden roads, forgotten storehouses, and ambitions that refused to die. Neither of them noticed the lone watcher concealed among the rocks across the valley. Wrapped in a ragged cloak stained the color of weathered earth, the figure remained motionless until both travelers disappeared from the ridge. Only then did it rise, revealing a broad frame and a heavy bow carried across its back. Without lighting a fire or speaking a word, the silent scout slipped into the darkness and began following the trail toward the south, keeping always beyond sight, yet never allowing the distance between hunter and prey to grow too great. The dawn wind swept over the hills with a bitter edge that carried the scent of wet stone and distant rain. Saruman left their hidden camp before the first pale light touched the eastern sky, unwilling to linger where another pair of eyes might have measured their movements during the night. Grima followed in weary silence, his boots slipping upon loose shale as they descended into a maze of narrow valleys. Every bend in the land concealed the next, and the road shown upon the old map had long since disappeared beneath grass and fallen rock. Only Saruman's memory and careful observation guided them now, for he had crossed these marches many years before, when Isengard's reach had quietly stretched farther than most guessed. The country grew harsher with every mile. Long ridges of black stone rose like broken walls from the earth, forcing the travelers to weave through twisting gullies where little sunlight reached the ground. Thorn bushes clung stubbornly to cracks in the rock, and pale lichen spread across boulders that had not been disturbed for generations. More than once, Grima noticed broken spear shafts or rusted scraps of mail half buried beneath the soil, relics left behind by forgotten skirmishers fought before either of them had walked those lands together. Each discovery reminded him that even abandoned places remembered violence long after the living had departed. Near midday, Saruman halted so abruptly that Grima nearly walked into him. The wizard crouched beside a patch of damp earth sheltered beneath an overhanging rock and brushed aside loose gravel with the tips of his fingers. Fresh hoofprints crossed the narrow path, accompanied by several sets of boot marks that showed neither haste nor disorder. Whoever had passed there had ridden confidently, stopping once to water their horses at a nearby spring before continuing southward. Saruman studied every impression with patient care before rising again, without a word. Grima could no longer contain his unease. "The same riders?" he asked quietly, glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting armed men to emerge from the rocks at any moment. Saruman shook his head only slightly. "No, these horses are better shod, and their riders carry greater weight. Perhaps wagons follow behind them." He narrowed his eyes toward the south, where the valleys merged into hazy distance. "Someone is transporting supplies, not merely wandering. Such journeys are planned, and planned journeys always have a destination." The path eventually opened into a broad basin where an ancient roadway crossed the valley floor. Great paving stones, cracked by frost and tangled with weeds, still marked the work of forgotten builders whose kingdoms had faded into memory. Along the roadside stood the shattered remains of carved pillars blackened by old fires, while broken milestones leaned drunkenly beneath blankets of moss. Grima paused beside one weathered stone, tracing faint letters that neither wind nor rain had entirely erased. He could not read them, but Saruman recognized the old Númenórean script and continued walking without comment, unwilling to waste precious time upon memories that offered no advantage. By afternoon, the clouds finally broke, and narrow shafts of sunlight reached across the empty basin. In that clearer light, they saw movement upon a distant ridge. Several dark figures appeared against the sky, for only a heartbeat before vanishing behind scattered pines. Grima instinctively reached for his knife, though he knew how little comfort it offered. Saruman merely watched until the ridge stood empty once more. "Scouts," he said calmly, too disciplined to expose themselves for long. They left the ancient road and climbed toward a cluster of wind-worn rocks overlooking the basin. From there, Saruman surveyed every approach with the eye of a commander, accustomed to judging both opportunity and danger. He remained motionless for so long that Grima wondered whether he had become lost in thought. But at last, the wizard spoke, without turning his head. "We are being measured," he said. "Not attacked. That means our pursuers still seek knowledge rather than blood." Grima found little comfort in that distinction, for knowledge often came before slaughter. As evening approached, they discovered an abandoned shepherd's shelter built beneath a great slab of stone. Its low walls still offered protection from the wind, and a dry spring nearby provided clear water flowing from the hillside. Grima gathered enough dead brush for a tiny fire hidden deep within the shelter, careful that no smoke escaped above the rocks. Saruman sat near the entrance, listening more than watching, while the fading daylight slowly surrendered to dusk. Every small sound carried unusual weight in the growing darkness. The scrape of pebbles, the cry of distant birds, the whisper of branches rubbing together high upon the slopes. Their meal consisted only of coarse bread softened in hot water, and a handful of bitter roots Grima had dug from the hillside. Hunger sharpened tempers that had long been worn thin by disappointment. "Your hidden store grows farther away with every league," Grima muttered, staring into the small flames. "Perhaps your captain abandoned it years ago. Perhaps there is nothing waiting at all." Saruman looked at him steadily, and for an instant the old force returned to his voice. "You mistake delay for failure. Had I survived by surrendering to uncertainty, I would never have ruled Isengard." Grima lowered his eyes, yet bitterness lingered within him. He remembered richly furnished chambers, warm meals, and servants who hurried at a command. Now those memories mocked him each time he chewed stale bread beneath an open sky. Still, despite every hardship, he remained beside the fallen wizard because the world beyond Saruman seemed even colder. He no longer knew whether loyalty, fear, or simple habit bound him to his master, and that uncertainty gnawed at him as relentlessly as hunger itself. Deep into the night, a faint whistle drifted across the hills. It lasted only a moment before another answered from much farther away. Saruman's eyes opened instantly, and he silently extinguished the fire beneath a blanket of loose earth. Both men waited without moving, scarcely daring to breathe as the darkness settled around them once more. The whistles came again, passing from ridge to ridge like hunting calls shared between unseen companions. They were too deliberate to belong to shepherds or wandering travelers. Hours passed before silence returned. Grima finally dared whisper, "They are searching." Saruman inclined his head almost imperceptibly. "Yes, but not blindly." He listened a while longer before adding, "Whatever lies ahead has become valuable enough that sentries now guard the approaches. We have arrived nearer the truth than I expected." His face remained composed, yet behind his calm expression, another realization slowly took shape. If strangers had organized such vigilance around the southern hills, then someone besides himself had already uncovered part of the secret hidden upon his old map. At first light they departed, without leaving so much as a cold ember behind. Neither man noticed that the shelter was inspected, scarcely an hour later, by a broad-shouldered orc, clad in patched mail darkened with soot. The creature knelt where the fire had burned, sniffed the ashes with surprising patience, then grinned as it discovered the faint imprint of Saruman's staff upon the damp earth. Rising without haste, it gave a low growl toward the ridge above, and from behind scattered rocks, 3 more orcs emerged in complete silence, before following the fresh trail southward. Rain began before sunrise, falling in a fine, cold mist that clung to cloaks and settled into every fold of cloth. The hills disappeared behind drifting grey veils, reducing the world to little more than the next ridge and the next winding path. Saruman welcomed the weather, for it blurred distant sight and softened the ground beneath every footstep, making fresh tracks difficult to judge after a few hours. Grima, however, found little comfort in the rain. Water seeped through his worn boots, and each mile left him colder than the last, while the damp air carried every unfamiliar sound farther across the empty country. They descended into a broad valley, where an old stream cut through banks of dark clay before bending eastward between steep slopes. Fallen trees lay scattered along its course, uprooted by storms years before, and moss had swallowed much of their decaying wood. Saruman paused beside the water, studying the current before stepping carefully from stone to stone until he reached the opposite bank. Grima followed with less grace, nearly slipping twice before scrambling onto solid ground. Without explanation, Saruman turned north for a short distance, walking directly along the stream instead of continuing south. Grima frowned, but held his tongue until they had covered nearly half a mile in the wrong direction. At last, he could bear the silence no longer. "The map leads the other way," he said, struggling to keep frustration from his voice. Saruman finally glanced toward him with the faintest trace of satisfaction. "Precisely," he replied. "Anyone following our tracks will believe we crossed here and continued north. They will waste precious hours before discovering the deception." Only then did he leave the stream, climbing back through thick brush toward the southern hills by a route that left almost no clear trail behind. The rain eased by midday, and weak sunlight filtered through ragged breaks in the clouds. Steam rose from the wet earth, while insects stirred among the grasses, filling the valley with a low, constant hum. They had scarcely climbed the next ridge when Saruman stopped once more and motioned Grima to crouch. Voices drifted faintly from beyond a cluster of weathered rocks. The words were harsh and broken, spoken in the black speech of Mordor, though rough accents suggested mouths long accustomed to other tongues. Saruman crept forward until he could peer between the stones without revealing himself. 4 orcs occupied a small hollow below, huddled around the remains of a smoky fire. Their armor was a mismatched collection of battered mail, cracked leather, and scavenged helmets taken from many different armies. One sharpened a broad knife upon a whetstone, while another gnawed at a strip of dried meat with restless impatience. Their leader, a squat creature whose left ear had been torn nearly away, unfolded a stained scrap of parchment and jabbed at it repeatedly with one dirty finger. Grima crawled beside his master and cautiously looked down into the hollow. He recognized no words from the orcs' conversation, yet their gestures spoke clearly enough. They argued over directions, cursed one another with growing anger, then repeatedly pointed toward the southern ridges. Saruman listened with narrowed eyes until the meaning became plain. "They seek the same road," he whispered so softly that Grima scarcely heard him. "But they possess only fragments of the truth." The 2 men withdrew without disturbing a single stone. They climbed through dense thickets until the orc voices faded behind them, neither daring to speak above a whisper. Only after reaching the crest of another ridge did Grima finally ask, "How can they know of your hidden place?" Saruman remained silent for several moments. Old memories stirred unwillingly within him, memories of captains rewarded with knowledge enough to obey orders, but never enough to threaten their master's authority. At length he answered, "Someone remembered more than he should have." The afternoon wore on beneath clearing skies. Far ahead, the land began to change as scattered hills gave way to a broad expanse of burned heath, where little grew except coarse grass and stubborn patches of grey brush. Black scars crossed the earth, where old fires had raced unchecked through the dry vegetation during the years of war. Charred tree trunks leaned at strange angles, like broken spears abandoned after battle. Even the wind seemed different there, carrying the dry smell of ash, though many seasons had passed since the flames. Near the center of that wasteland stood the crumbling remains of a stone wayhouse built beside the ancient road. Its roof had long ago collapsed, but one corner still offered shelter enough for travelers seeking rest. Saruman approached cautiously, circling the ruin before entering. Fresh ashes lay within an old hearth, and several empty water skins had been discarded beneath a broken bench. Whoever had camped there had departed only that morning, leaving behind the faint warmth of their passing. Grima knelt beside the ashes and picked up a small object half buried beneath soot. It was a copper button marked with the image of a white hand, blackened by smoke but still clearly visible. His face paled as he turned it over in trembling fingers. "From Isengard," he murmured. Saruman accepted the button without a word, studying it with unreadable eyes before quietly slipping it into his sleeve. Once such a token had adorned the uniforms of soldiers who marched proudly beneath his command. Now it lay abandoned in the dirt like every oath sworn to him. For the first time since leaving Isengard, genuine uncertainty settled upon the wizard's face. The button could only have belonged to one of his former servants, or to someone who had stripped it from a corpse years before. Either possibility troubled him. If even a handful of old retainers had survived, they might have gathered around a leader of their own choosing, rather than await the return of a disgraced master. Ambition rarely died with kingdoms. More often, it merely changed hands. They remained inside the ruined wayhouse until twilight, conserving their strength for the road ahead. Grima slept fitfully against the broken wall, while Saruman sat motionless near the doorway, turning the old copper button over between his fingers. He recalled faces long forgotten by nearly everyone else, captains eager for promotion, craftsmen who built engines of war, messengers who carried sealed commands across hidden roads. Many had been clever men, clever enough, perhaps, to preserve fragments of Isengard after its fall. As darkness settled across the wasteland, a distant horn sounded from somewhere beyond the southern ridges. It was answered moments later by another, lower and harsher, echoing across the empty heath before silence returned. Saruman slowly rose to his feet, every trace of weariness replaced by alert purpose. "The hunt has begun," he said quietly. Grima looked into the darkness beyond the ruined doorway and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, for he understood that the horns had not been calling wandering travelers. They had been calling organized bands, already moving through the wastelands, and sooner or later, every one of those paths would converge upon the same forgotten fortress that Saruman sought. The horns were silent by morning, yet the memory of their echoes lingered over the wasteland like smoke that refused to disperse. Saruman and Grima left the ruined wayhouse before first light, walking with measured haste across ground where every rise offered a view in all directions. The burned heath stretched for miles, broken only by low ridges of black stone and the occasional skeleton of an ancient oak that had never recovered from the fires of war. Ash still gathered in shallow hollows whenever the wind changed, drifting across their path in pale grey swirls that coated boots and hems alike. The country felt abandoned, but it was not empty, and both travelers sensed unseen movement beyond the horizon. They had gone scarcely 2 hours when Saruman raised one hand without speaking. Grima froze at once, following his master's gaze toward a distant slope where several crows had burst suddenly into the air. No cry of alarm reached them, yet the birds wheeled in a tight circle before scattering eastward. Saruman slowly crouched behind a ridge of broken stone and motioned Grima to do the same. Moments later, 3 figures crossed the crest where the birds had risen, moving carefully rather than hurriedly, their weapons held ready despite the absence of any visible threat. These were not orcs. Their cloaks were weathered brown, their beards untrimmed, and each carried a long spear together with a round shield patched many times over. They paused frequently to inspect the ground, speaking in low voices before changing direction with obvious purpose. Grima studied them uneasily. "The riders from the village?" he whispered. Saruman watched until the men disappeared beyond another hill before answering. "Perhaps. They know how to track, but they search too widely. They have lost the trail." The wizard remained hidden until he judged the strangers safely distant. Only then did he stand and continue southward, though now he avoided every obvious path across the open heath. Grima followed without complaint, understanding at last why Saruman so often abandoned roads that promised easier travel. The old wizard had lost much, yet one talent remained untouched by defeat. Few living men understood pursuit, concealment, and deception as thoroughly as one who had spent decades weaving hidden designs beneath the notice of allies and enemies alike. By midday, the land began to descend toward a shallow basin littered with shattered stone blocks. At first, Grima mistook them for natural outcrops, but as they drew nearer, he saw weathered carvings beneath the moss and recognized the broken foundations of ancient buildings. Long ago, a settlement had stood there, perhaps little more than a fortified crossroads, yet nothing remained above waist height. Fallen walls formed twisting passages through which the wind sighed softly, carrying with it the dry smell of dust and old mortar. Saruman moved cautiously among the ruins until he reached the remains of a square courtyard, where fragments of carved pillars still lay scattered. He knelt beside one fallen block and brushed away years of dirt from a narrow crack beneath it. After several moments, his fingers found what they sought. Hidden beneath the stone rested a small iron box no larger than a man's hand, sealed against weather with wax that had hardened almost to stone. Grima stared in astonishment as Saruman lifted it free with surprising care. The lock yielded after a few patient turns of the dull knife Grima carried. Inside lay no jewels, no gold, nor any object of obvious value. Instead, there rested a folded strip of oiled cloth protecting several small parchment slips covered in coded writing, together with a silver ring bearing the white hand of Isengard engraved upon its face. Saruman examined the parchments one by one, his expression unreadable, before quietly placing most of them back inside the box. Only one slip he kept within his sleeve. "A dead drop," he murmured. "One of many. I had almost forgotten this one." Grima looked from the ring to the hidden box with growing confusion. "Your servants left messages here?" he asked. Saruman nodded faintly while resealing the container. Couriers traveled these roads without ever meeting. One would leave instructions, another would collect them weeks later. No captain knew every hiding place. He hesitated before replacing the box beneath the stone exactly as he had found it. If this cache remained untouched, then others may also have survived the war. The discovery restored a measure of confidence that hardship had nearly extinguished. Saruman's pace quickened, and for the first time in many days he seemed to walk with purpose instead of mere determination. Yet Grima noticed something else. The coded message hidden inside the wizard's sleeve had not pleased him entirely. Beneath the brief spark of satisfaction lingered an unease that deepened with every passing mile, as though the forgotten note had confirmed not only hope but danger. Clouds gathered again during the afternoon, casting long shadows across the broken land. As they climbed from the ruins, a faint metallic sound drifted upon the wind. Saruman immediately halted, listening. It came again, the unmistakable clink of mail striking stone. He quickly drew Grima behind a tangle of thorn bushes, overlooking a narrow defile through which the ancient road continued south. A column of orcs marched below them, nearly 20 in number. They carried bundles upon their backs rather than loot, and 2 heavily laden mules stumbled along near the center of the company. Their discipline surprised even Saruman. They spoke little, kept steady intervals between one another, and obeyed silent gestures from a tall orc whose battered helmet had once belonged to a soldier of Gondor. Scarred from brow to jaw, the captain walked with slow confidence, pausing only once to examine the road ahead before giving another signal. Saruman's eyes narrowed. Something about the captain stirred an unwelcome memory. He had seen countless orc leaders during the years of alliance with Mordor, yet this one's measured caution differed from the reckless brutality common among their kind. The captain bent to inspect a faint footprint left in the damp earth, then smiled with grim satisfaction before pointing south. He was tracking someone, not expertly, but well enough to remain dangerous. Grima leaned close enough that his whisper scarcely disturbed the air. "Do they follow us?" Saruman considered the question carefully before answering. Not yet with certainty. He continued watching until the last orc disappeared beyond the bend in the road. But they know another seeker walks ahead of them. If they discover who that is, they will not hesitate. His voice remained calm, though inwardly he measured the distance between hunter and hunted with increasing concern. Only after the orcs had gone did the 2 travelers descend from their hiding place. They crossed the road quickly and vanished into a maze of weathered ravines where shadows already lengthened beneath the evening sky. Behind them, the wind erased little of their passage, for the ash clung stubbornly to every footprint. Far ahead, beyond the next chain of hills, the broken silhouette of a lonely fortress briefly appeared against the western light before fading once more into haze. It stood so distant that Grima almost believed he had imagined it, but Saruman had seen it too, and for the first time since leaving Isengard, he knew they were drawing close to the place where old secrets still waited beneath forgotten stone. The distant outline of the fortress remained visible only for a few moments before evening mist swallowed it once more. Even so, the brief glimpse altered the mood of the journey. What had been a rumor traced upon faded parchment had become something solid upon the horizon, a destination that could be reached by weary feet rather than imagination alone. Saruman said nothing, yet his stride lengthened with quiet resolve. Grima followed with renewed effort, though every instinct warned him that the closer they came to the fortress, the fewer chances remained to turn aside from whatever awaited them there. The ravines wound southward through ridges of cracked basalt, their steep walls shielding the travelers from distant eyes. Narrow game trails crossed one another in confusing patterns, and loose stones often slid beneath their boots, sending small echoes bouncing through the gullies. Saruman frequently stopped to listen before choosing the next turn, trusting sound as much as sight. Once he knelt beside a trickle of water flowing between smooth rocks and watched floating leaves drift past. Their movement revealed a hidden passage where the ravine narrowed into a cleft almost invisible from above, and he led Grima through it without hesitation. Beyond the cleft, they entered a valley unlike any they had crossed before. The grass there had grown taller, nourished by springs hidden beneath the earth, and scattered ash trees spread thin branches across the slopes, yet signs of recent occupation lay everywhere. Firewood had been cut from living trunks rather than gathered from fallen branches. Hoofprints crossed the soft ground in several directions. Someone had even repaired part of an old stone bridge with freshly shaped timbers no more than a season old. Grima ran a hand over the clean axe marks and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "They are preparing for long use," Saruman observed quietly. "No traveler mends a bridge unless he expects to cross it again." He studied the repairs with growing attention before kneeling beside one upright beam. Pressed into the damp wood was the faint impression of a carved symbol that most eyes would have overlooked. It resembled 3 short lines meeting beneath a circle. Grima stared without recognition, but Saruman's expression darkened. "A work mark," he said. "One of my old builders used this sign to count finished labor." His fingers lingered upon the carving for only a heartbeat before he stood again. Grima searched the valley anxiously. Then they truly survived. Saruman looked toward the southern hills rather than at his companion. "Some did," he answered. "Whether they remained faithful is another question." The words carried neither hope nor bitterness, only calculation. Men who had once served Isengard had lived for years without orders from their master. During such years, loyalties changed, new ambitions grew, and necessity often proved stronger than memory. The valley narrowed once more until a line of great boulders blocked the easiest path forward. As Saruman approached, he noticed fresh chips of stone scattered across the ground. Someone had broken rock there not long ago, clearing a route large enough for loaded wagons. Beyond the gap lay deep wheel ruts preserved in drying mud. Several wagons had passed within the previous week, heavy enough to sink nearly to their axles, despite the firm ground. Grima crouched beside the tracks, tracing them with uncertain fingers. "Supplies," he whispered. "Many supplies." Saruman nodded slowly. Not merely food. His sharp eyes had found small black flakes glinting among the ruts. He picked one up and rolled it between his fingertips before holding it toward the fading light. It was charcoal mixed with traces of iron dust. Nearby lay tiny fragments of broken nails, still carrying fresh hammer marks. Tools, timber, forge work. He let the fragments fall back into the dirt. Someone intends to rebuild more than shelter. Toward late afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying distant sounds through the valley. At first, they seemed no more than faint echoes, but gradually the rhythm became unmistakable. Iron striking iron, slow, steady, deliberate. Not the ringing of battle, but the patient labor of a smith at his anvil. Grima stopped walking altogether, straining to hear. The blows continued with measured intervals before fading again into the hills. "There should be no forge here," Grima murmured. "There should be many things that no longer exist," Saruman replied, "yet someone has restored them." He motioned for silence and climbed a rocky slope overlooking the source of the sound. The ascent was difficult, forcing both men to pull themselves upward by exposed roots and weathered stone. At the summit, Saruman carefully eased himself behind a fractured ledge and peered into the valley beyond. Smoke drifted lazily from several chimneys hidden among clusters of pine, and below them stood a fenced encampment built around the ruins of an older settlement. Men moved between rough wooden buildings, carrying bundles of timber, barrels and sacks of grain. Others repaired wagons, while 2 blacksmiths labored beneath a simple shelter, their hammers sending bright sparks into the cooling air. Grima's eyes widened. Nearly 50 people occupied the camp, more than enough to defend themselves against wandering raiders. Some wore patched armor bearing no emblem, while others carried bows and axes suited for frontier work rather than open war. Horses grazed within stout enclosures, and armed sentries watched every approach from raised platforms built among the trees. Nothing about the settlement suggested desperation. It had the look of a community preparing for endurance rather than flight. Saruman studied every face he could distinguish. Most were strangers, hardened by years of survival. But one man near the forge drew his attention at once. Broad-shouldered despite advancing age, with grey threaded through his dark beard, he walked with the easy confidence of one accustomed to command. Around his neck hung a polished silver ring that flashed briefly in the firelight. Even from that distance, Saruman recognized it. It matched the ring hidden inside the iron box beneath the ruined crossroads. "So," Saruman murmured almost to himself, "Edric still lives." Grima looked at him in surprise. "You know him?" "I knew him." Saruman's voice remained level, yet memories stirred with unusual clarity. Edric had once overseen hidden supply depots across the southern marches, a capable organizer who asked few questions and remembered every instruction. He had been loyal because loyalty had served his interests. Whether that remained true after years without Isengard was impossible to judge from afar. Men changed, sometimes far more completely than orcs ever could. As twilight settled over the valley, another figure entered the camp from the southern road. The newcomer rode a dark horse, lathered with sweat, and every sentry straightened at once upon seeing him. Edric himself walked forward to meet the rider. No words reached the ridge where Saruman watched, but the urgency of their gestures spoke plainly. The rider unrolled a stained map across a work table while several leaders gathered around. Fingers pointed north, then east. Finally, they all turned toward the distant hills where the forgotten fortress waited. Saruman slowly withdrew from the ridge, his face harder than stone. Whatever secret remained within the fortress, Edric was no longer merely guarding supplies left by a fallen master. He was searching for the same prize. Worse still, he possessed enough knowledge to gather disciplined men, rebuild old roads, and organize the wilderness around him. As the last light faded from the sky, Saruman understood that the journey ahead would no longer be a race against scattered scavengers. It had become a contest against a man whom he himself had once taught to keep secrets. Night settled over the valley with slow certainty, and one by one the fires of Edric's camp sprang to life beneath the sheltering pines. Their glow reflected faintly against low clouds, forming a dull orange haze above the trees that could be seen from every surrounding ridge. Saruman and Grima remained concealed among the rocks until full darkness covered the land, speaking only in whispers when speech became necessary. The wizard's gaze seldom left the camp below. He counted the changing sentries, measured the intervals between patrols, and noted every lantern that moved from one building to another. Years before, he himself had taught trusted captains to arrange a camp in precisely that manner, with overlapping watches and concealed reserves prepared to answer an attack before confusion could spread. Grima shifted uneasily beside him, rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers. "If this Edric commands so many men," he whispered, "we cannot simply walk among them." Saruman answered without taking his eyes from the valley. "No, but every camp, however disciplined, depends upon routine. Routine breeds confidence, and confidence leaves doors unguarded. His voice carried the calm certainty that had once directed armies, yet inwardly he knew this task demanded far greater caution than any he had faced in years. He no longer possessed the commanding presence that could bend doubtful minds by sheer force of will. If deception failed now, there would be no hidden strength to rescue him. They waited until the moon climbed above the eastern hills before descending the far side of the ridge. Rather than approach the camp directly, Saruman led Grima in a wide circle through dense woodland where fallen needles muffled every footstep. The trees grew thicker there than elsewhere in the valley, their branches woven tightly enough to conceal movement from distant eyes. At intervals, Saruman paused beside trunks marked by old axe cuts, faint signs left decades earlier by Isengard's foresters. Though weathered almost beyond recognition, they confirmed that he still remembered the secret approaches laid out in another age. Near midnight, they reached the edge of a narrow clearing where several supply wagons stood beneath rough shelters of timber and canvas. Unlike the central camp, this outlying store was guarded by only 2 men, both wrapped in heavy cloaks against the chill. One leaned upon his spear, while the other sat beside a lantern, cleaning mud from a saddle. Their conversation drifted softly through the darkness, carried by the light breeze that stirred the pines. They spoke not of war, but of harvests, broken wheels, and the coming winter, sounding less like soldiers than weary settlers forced into guarding duties they scarcely welcomed. Saruman observed them for several minutes before turning toward Grima. "Remain here," he said quietly. "If I call, do not answer unless I use your name." Grima opened his mouth to protest, but the wizard had already slipped into the shadows with surprising silence. Hidden behind the thick trunks, he moved slowly from one patch of darkness to the next, until he stood scarcely 20 paces from the guards. Then, with careful precision, he tossed a small stone into the undergrowth beyond the wagons. The sound was slight, little more than a branch disturbed beneath cautious feet, yet both guards reacted instantly. One seized his spear, while the other lifted the lantern and walked toward the noise, muttering that wolves had grown bolder since autumn began. His companion followed after only a moment's hesitation, unwilling to remain alone beside the wagons. Within seconds, the clearing stood empty. Saruman emerged from concealment, crossed the open ground without haste, and disappeared beneath the nearest canvas shelter before either guard reached the bushes they had gone to investigate. Grima watched in astonishment as the wizard searched the wagons with swift, practiced movements. Saruman opened sacks only far enough to glimpse their contents before tying them closed again, exactly as he had found them. Grain, salted meat, iron bars, bundles of arrows wrapped against damp weather, a chest filled with horseshoes. Everything pointed toward careful preparation for a long campaign, rather than simple survival. At last, Saruman found what he sought inside a locked wooden coffer secured beneath one wagon. The lock was sturdy but old, and Grima saw the familiar patience return to Saruman's hands. A narrow strip of iron taken from the ruined crossroads slid into the keyhole, turned once, twice, and then the lid lifted without a sound. Inside lay rolled maps, sealed messages, and several polished stones marked with painted symbols. Saruman unrolled the uppermost parchment, only enough to reveal its center, before his expression sharpened with sudden attention. There, clearly drawn in dark ink, stood the outline of the forgotten fortress, together with every approach through the surrounding hills. Before he could study further, voices returned from the edge of the clearing. The guards had found nothing among the bushes and were already making their way back, grumbling about startled foxes. Saruman closed the chest immediately, restoring every item to its exact place. By the time the first guard stepped beneath the shelter once more, the wizard had vanished into the surrounding darkness. Only a faint movement among distant branches betrayed the path by which he escaped. The two travelers withdrew nearly half a mile before stopping beside a dry stream bed hidden beneath overhanging rocks. Grima's breathing remained quick from the tension of their retreat. "What did you see?" he asked, keeping his voice low despite the distance now separating them from the camp. Saruman remained silent, while recalling every detail fixed in his remarkable memory. Finally, he stooped and drew a rough outline in the damp sand with a slender stick. "The fortress has 3 known approaches," he said. "Edric guards the western road. The orcs we observed likely search the eastern ravines. That leaves the northern cliffs." He marked a narrow line climbing toward the fortress walls. Difficult ground, too steep for wagons, too dangerous for large companies, which is precisely why no one expects it to be used. Grima studied the sketch uneasily. "Can we climb it?" "We can." "You are certain?" Saruman looked toward the hidden camp where the fires still glowed faintly through the trees. "No," he answered with unusual honesty. "But certainty has become a luxury reserved for stronger men than we." For a long while, neither spoke. The wind whispered softly through the pines, carrying with it the distant ring of hammers from the camp where work continued even after midnight. Grima stared at the rough map traced into the sand, until another thought occurred to him. If Edric already knows where the fortress stands, why has he not entered it? Saruman slowly erased the drawing with the side of his boot before answering. "Because he lacks something." "What?" "The final key." Grima frowned. "A key of iron?" Saruman shook his head. "No, a key of memory." He did not explain further, but his hand unconsciously touched the folded parchment hidden inside his robe, the single message recovered from the forgotten dead drop. It contained only a few coded lines, meaningless to anyone else, yet one phrase had returned to him again and again throughout the day. It described not a door nor a lock, but an ancient signal, known only to the trusted overseers of Isengard's hidden places. Without that signal, the fortress might remain sealed forever. Far away, beyond both camp and forest, another pair of eyes watched the valley from the eastern hills. The scarred orc captain stood motionless among scattered boulders, while one of his scouts reported in hushed tones. When the scout finished, the captain gazed toward Edric's fires, then slowly turned his head northward, where Saruman and Grima had disappeared into the darkness. A harsh smile spread across his scarred face. At last he understood that 3 different hunters now pursued the same forgotten prize, and he intended to let the others clear the path before claiming it for himself. They departed before the moon had begun its descent, leaving the shelter of the stream bed while darkness still concealed every movement. Saruman chose the northern route without hesitation, leading Grima away from Edric's camp and toward a wilderness of broken cliffs where few men willingly traveled. The forest thinned behind them until only scattered pines clung to the rocky slopes, their roots twisting through cracks that widened with every winter frost. Before them rose a wall of dark stone, stretching east and west across the land, like the ruins of some forgotten mountain. Somewhere beyond those heights stood the fortress that had survived hidden through years of war and ruin. The climb began gently enough, following the course of a dry waterway that had carved a winding passage through the lower rocks. Loose gravel shifted beneath every step, and the silence of the valley gave way to the constant scrape of boots against stone. Grima struggled to keep pace, frequently catching himself upon jagged ledges before he slipped too far. Saruman climbed more carefully than swiftly, conserving his strength while choosing each foothold with practiced precision. He had crossed these cliffs only once before, many years ago, but the memory of the route had endured where countless other details had faded. As dawn approached, they reached a narrow shelf overlooking the valleys below. Mist still covered the lower ground, hiding Edric's settlement from view, yet thin columns of smoke rose through the grey blanket like lonely towers. Saruman knelt beside the edge and surveyed the country beyond. Faint movement caught his attention far to the east. A long line of dark figures wound through another ravine, too distant for clear features, but their steady pace and ordered formation left little doubt as to their identity. The orc captain was advancing with his company toward the eastern approaches exactly as Saruman had expected. "They move quickly," Grima whispered after following his master's gaze. "They have abandoned caution," Saruman replied. "That usually means they believe victory is close." He rose without another word and resumed the climb. The higher they ascended, the more barren the land became. Grass disappeared altogether, replaced by bare stone, polished smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Great cracks divided the cliffs into towering pillars, and in several places the path narrowed until a single misstep would have sent a traveler tumbling into unseen depths below. Cold air drifted upward from those chasms, carrying the smell of damp earth and ancient rock. Grima avoided looking down whenever possible, fixing his eyes instead upon Saruman's steady movements ahead. By midday, they reached the entrance to a narrow gorge almost completely concealed between two towering walls of stone. Thick patches of thorn and twisted juniper grew across its mouth, hiding the passage from anyone approaching across the open slopes. Saruman parted the branches carefully and stepped inside. The gorge immediately swallowed both light and sound. High above, only a ribbon of pale sky remained visible, while the floor beneath their feet was strewn with rounded stones worn smooth by long-vanished floods. Grima glanced around uneasily. "This place feels untouched." "It was meant to." Saruman's voice echoed softly from the cliffs. "No patrol could easily find it. Even in my stronger days, I trusted very few with this road." The gorge wound deeper into the mountain, turning so frequently that no straight view extended more than a few dozen paces. Several times, Saruman paused beside weathered carvings, almost invisible beneath moss. They resembled natural cracks at first glance, yet each had been shaped deliberately by careful hands. He touched one briefly before continuing, confirming that they still marked the correct direction. Whoever had built the hidden route had done their work well. Decades of neglect had concealed nearly every sign without destroying them. Late in the afternoon, they reached a place where the gorge divided into three nearly identical passages. Each curved away behind towering stone walls, making it impossible to see farther than a short distance. Grima looked from one opening to the next with growing uncertainty. "Which is the true road?" he asked. Saruman remained motionless. Instead of answering immediately, he studied the stone beneath his feet, then the shape of the cliffs above. Finally, he walked toward the middle passage before abruptly stopping. His eyes narrowed. "No," he murmured. He turned instead toward the passage on the left. Grima frowned. "What changed?" "Someone altered the markers." The words hung heavily in the still air. Saruman approached a weathered carving upon the wall and brushed away fresh dust with the edge of his sleeve. Beneath it, another line had recently been chiseled into the stone, subtle enough to deceive anyone relying upon memory alone. The alteration was skillfully made, yet not skillfully enough to escape the eye of the man who had ordered the original work. "Edric," Saruman said quietly. He wished to send others into the wrong gorge. Grima stared down the abandoned middle passage where darkness gathered beneath overhanging cliffs. A trap? Perhaps, or merely a dead end. Saruman's expression hardened. He remembers almost everything. The left-hand passage gradually widened until sunlight once more reached the ground. Ahead stood the remains of a massive stone stair carved directly into the mountainside. Time had shattered many of its steps, leaving gaps that forced careful climbing, while bushes grew from cracks between the weathered blocks. Even ruined, the stair retained an air of forgotten grandeur. Whoever had built it possessed both great skill and the desire to conceal strength within these lonely heights. Halfway up the staircase, Saruman halted once more. A body lay slumped against the wall where the path narrowed between broken pillars. The man had been dead no more than 2 days. His leather armor bore no badge, but his cloak matched those worn by Edric's followers. A short arrow protruded from beneath his shoulder blade, and his sword remained sheathed, suggesting he had never seen his killer. Grima knelt beside the corpse, while Saruman examined the surrounding stones. Only one set of footprints led away from the place of death. They belonged to heavy boots with broad heels, unlike those worn by Edric's men. "The Orc captain," Saruman said. He sent a scout ahead. Grima looked nervously toward the upper stair. "Then the Orcs are closer than we believed." "No." Saruman straightened slowly. "One Orc is closer." His gaze lingered upon the arrow. It was shorter than those carried by ordinary Orc soldiers, carefully fletched and balanced with unusual craftsmanship. "A hunter." The realization settled heavily upon both travelers. A single skilled scout moved somewhere ahead among the cliffs, watching the approaches while the larger company advanced behind him. As evening shadows lengthened across the mountainside, Saruman and Grima climbed the final stretch of broken stairs until they reached a broad ledge overlooking the valleys far below. There, beyond one last ridge of black stone, the forgotten fortress finally stood revealed in its entirety. Though smaller than Isengard and far older, it remained remarkably intact. High walls crowned the rocky summit, while a square keep rose above them with narrow windows, dark as empty eyes. No banner flew from its battlements. No smoke rose from within. It appeared abandoned, silent, and lifeless beneath the fading light. Yet as Saruman studied the ancient walls, he noticed something that made him stop where he stood. The great gate was no longer closed. It stood open by scarcely the width of a man's hand. Someone had already entered. The narrow gap between the gate leaves seemed almost insignificant from the ledge, yet Saruman knew it should not have existed at all. When the fortress had last served Isengard in secret, its entrance had been sealed so completely that even the hinges vanished behind fitted stone. No wind, no passing season, and no wandering beast could have forced those ancient doors apart. Only deliberate hands had broken the silence that had endured there for years. Grima stared at the opening without speaking, feeling as though the fortress itself watched those who approached with patient indifference. They remained upon the ridge until the last light faded from the western sky. Saruman refused to descend while daylight still favored hidden eyes within the walls. Instead, he studied every tower, every stretch of battlement, and every shadow where a sentry might stand unseen. No movement revealed itself. The place possessed the stillness of a tomb, yet it was not the stillness of abandonment. It was the quiet that followed careful preparation when men waited for others to make the first mistake. Only after darkness had settled across the mountains did they begin the final approach. The old road leading to the gate had collapsed in several places, forcing them to cross heaps of shattered masonry and patches of loose scree. Here and there, fragments of carved stone emerged from the rubble, bearing worn patterns that had once adorned walls now broken beyond repair. Grima found himself placing each foot with painful care, not only to avoid noise, but because every echo seemed to linger unnaturally long among the cliffs. Even his breathing sounded too loud in the narrow pass. They reached the gate shortly before midnight. Massive oak beams, reinforced with blackened iron, formed each leaf, though age had cracked the wood and rust had spread across the metal straps. Saruman placed one hand against the cold surface and gently pushed. The gate moved inward with surprising ease, opening another few inches before stopping against some unseen obstruction. No creak disturbed the silence. Long ago, the hinges had been crafted with uncommon skill, and despite years of neglect, they still turned almost soundlessly. Beyond the entrance lay a broad outer courtyard, enclosed by weathered stone walls. Weeds pushed through every crack between the paving stones, and fallen leaves had gathered in wind-blown corners untouched by any broom. Yet other signs spoke of recent visitors. Fresh footprints crossed the dust in several directions. A discarded torch lay beside an old well, its charred end still smelling faintly of pitch. Near one wall stood 3 empty barrels that had not been there when Saruman last remembered the place. Someone had carried them inside only days before. Grima crouched beside the nearest trail and quietly counted the different prints. "Many men," he whispered. "Perhaps 20. Saruman slowly shook his head. "Not together." He pointed toward one set of deeper impressions. These were made when the ground was wet. His finger moved to another, crossing them at an angle. Those came later. Finally, he indicated several lighter tracks near the well, and these are scarcely half a day old. He rose with a troubled expression. Different groups have entered at different times. They advanced across the courtyard toward the keep, rising at its center. The lower windows stood empty, their wooden shutters long since rotted away, while ivy climbed nearly to the roof. A broad stair led to the main doors, one of which hung partly open. Before climbing the steps, Saruman suddenly held out an arm, stopping Grima where he stood. His eyes had settled upon something almost invisible against the stone. A thin cord stretched across the stair, no higher than a man's ankle. Grima felt his pulse quicken. "I never placed that there." Saruman knelt without touching the cord. Following its path with careful eyes, he saw it disappear into a narrow crack beside the doorway. He searched the surrounding stone until he discovered several freshly drilled holes hidden beneath loose dust. "A warning device," he murmured. "For whom?" "Anyone entering after the first visitors." Drawing his dull knife, Grima carefully slid the blade beneath the cord and lifted it just enough for Saruman to inspect its tension. Instead of cutting it immediately, the wizard traced its course once more, then quietly loosened a concealed peg, anchoring it to the wall. The line sagged harmlessly against the steps, without triggering whatever mechanism lay beyond. Saruman gave a single approving nod. Whoever had prepared the trap possessed patience, but not the meticulous caution he himself demanded of trusted servants. Inside the keep, the air felt cold and stale, carrying the smell of damp stone mixed with the faint odor of extinguished torches. Their footsteps echoed softly through a great hall whose walls remained lined with empty weapon racks and broken benches. Dust blanketed much of the floor, but wide paths had recently been cleared by repeated passage. Saruman paused beside one wall, where faded hooks still held fragments of rusted chain. Once supplies had hung there, awaiting transport across the southern marches. Now only silence occupied the room. At the far end of the hall they found the first unmistakable sign of violence. One of Edric's men lay sprawled beside a fallen torch, his hand still clutching a short sword stained with drying blood. Unlike the dead scout upon the mountain stair, this man had fought fiercely before dying. Deep cuts scarred the stone around him, while several broken arrows lay scattered across the floor. A broad smear of blood led toward a side passage where someone wounded had dragged himself away. Grima swallowed hard. The orcs reached them. Saruman examined the wounds more closely before answering. No. He pointed toward the dead man's sword. The blade bears human blood. Grima stared in confusion. They fought each other? So it seems. Saruman looked down the blood-stained passage. Or someone persuaded them to. Neither possibility pleased him. They followed the trail cautiously until it ended before a heavy iron-bound door standing half open. Beyond it stretched a circular chamber built beneath the keep itself. Stone shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, though most now stood empty. Broken chests, shattered jars, and scattered parchments covered the floor where frantic hands had searched every corner. Lantern light had blackened the ceiling with fresh soot, and overturned furniture showed that several groups had competed to uncover whatever had once been hidden there. Saruman walked slowly through the wreckage, saying nothing. At the center of the chamber stood a great stone table carved with a detailed map of the surrounding lands. Someone had recently struck it repeatedly with hammers, breaking away several sections. Yet one fragment remained untouched. Upon its smooth surface, a single symbol had been carved centuries earlier. 3 lines meeting beneath a circle. The same mark they had found upon the repaired bridge. Grima looked from the carving to Saruman. What does it mean? The wizard rested one hand upon the cold stone. It marks the overseer's chamber. He searched the room carefully, but after several minutes his face darkened. The wrong room. Grima frowned. This is not what you came for. No. Saruman turned slowly toward the shattered shelves. They have been searching exactly where I expected them to search. His voice fell almost to a whisper. Which means the true hiding place is still concealed. Even as he spoke, a faint sound drifted through the silent keep. Not the heavy tread of marching orcs. Not the voices of Edric's men. A single footstep. Somewhere on the floor above them. Someone else was moving through the fortress, and whoever it was had taken great care not to be heard until that single careless moment. The faint footstep above them vanished so quickly that Grima wondered whether he had imagined it. He held his breath, listening with painful concentration, while the silence settled once more over the underground chamber. Water dripped somewhere within the walls, each drop echoing through the stone passages with deceptive clarity. Saruman remained perfectly still beside the carved table, his head tilted slightly, as though separating one sound from another. After several moments, he slowly raised one finger, warning Grima to remain where he was. Without speaking, the wizard crossed the chamber toward a narrow stair built into the thickness of the wall. The steps climbed in a tight spiral, disappearing into darkness above. Dust lay thick upon the lower treads, yet halfway up the staircase, the coating had been disturbed by recent passage. Saruman knelt and brushed the stone lightly with the back of his fingers. Only one set of footprints was visible, neither large enough for an orc, nor heavy enough to belong to a man burdened with armor. Whoever moved above them traveled alone and lightly equipped. Grima followed several steps behind, trying to place each foot exactly where Saruman had stepped before him. The climb seemed endless inside the confined shaft, where the air smelled of old mortar and damp timber. At last the staircase ended, behind a narrow wooden door standing slightly ajar. Saruman eased it open by the width of a hand and looked into the chamber beyond. Moonlight streamed through broken shutters, revealing what had once been the fortress archive. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Many collapsed beneath the weight of rotted scrolls and ruined ledgers. Torn pages drifted across the floor whenever the wind entered through the shattered windows. The room appeared empty. Saruman did not trust appearances. He waited almost a full minute before stepping inside. Grima had scarcely entered after him when a loose board creaked somewhere beyond the shelves. Both men turned instantly. A dark figure slipped between two rows of collapsed bookcases before disappearing again. The movement was swift, almost silent, and revealed little more than a hooded cloak and the brief flash of a drawn knife. Grima instinctively reached for his own weapon, though his hands trembled. Saruman remained strangely calm. "Come out," he called softly. "I know you are no orc." For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the stranger emerged from behind the broken shelves, keeping a cautious distance. It was a young man with weathered features and weary eyes, dressed in patched leather, stained by dust and old travel. A short bow hung across his back, while the knife remained steady in his hand. His gaze shifted from Saruman to Grima, and back again with open suspicion. "You should not be here," the stranger said quietly. "Neither should you," Saruman replied. The young man frowned. "This place belongs to no one." Saruman's expression did not change. "On the contrary, it once belonged to me." The stranger studied the old wizard more closely, his face gradually losing color. Recognition came slowly, not from robes or appearance, but from something harder to define. He lowered the knife only a fraction. "You are—" "I was called Saruman." The young man's eyes widened despite himself. "I thought you were dead." "So did many others." The answer carried neither pride nor shame. The stranger hesitated before speaking again. "My name is Halen. I served Edric until yesterday." Grima glanced sharply toward him. "Until yesterday?" Halen nodded grimly. "He promised that the supplies hidden here would help build a new beginning. Instead, he became obsessed with finding records that none of us had ever heard of. When several men questioned him, Steele answered where words should have been enough." He glanced toward the floor below, where the dead man lay. "The first blood spilled came from our own company." Saruman listened without interruption, though inwardly every sentence confirmed his growing suspicion. Edric had not merely sought forgotten stores of grain or weapons. He pursued something far more dangerous, something worth sacrificing loyal followers to obtain. That was not the conduct of a practical quartermaster. It was the behavior of a man chasing power. "What records?" Saruman asked. Halen slowly shook his head. "I never saw them, only heard whispers." He lowered his voice instinctively. "They say there is a chamber beneath the oldest foundations. Not an armory, not a treasury, a vault." Grima looked toward Saruman. "The true hiding place." The wizard gave no reply, yet his silence was answer enough. Halen stepped closer, though caution still governed every movement. Edric believes the vault contains names. "What names?" Grima asked. "The names of every messenger, merchant, village elder and chieftain who secretly served Isengard before the war." His words hung heavily in the ruined archive. "He says that whoever holds those records can rebuild influence across all these lands without raising an army." Saruman closed his eyes for the briefest moment. So the secret had survived. Long before open war consumed Middle-earth, Saruman had woven quiet alliances across the southern marches. Many who accepted his gold had never marched beneath the White Hand. They remained hidden in their villages, their caravans, and their halls, passing information when called upon. Their identities had always been recorded in only one place, secured so completely that even Saruman himself had rarely thought of the list. He opened his eyes again. "Edric remembers too much." Halen nodded. "He has searched this fortress for 3 days. And found nothing?" "Nothing." Saruman almost smiled. Then he searched as I expected. Before another word could be spoken, a heavy crash echoed somewhere within the lower halls. It was followed immediately by a shout, cut short in mid-cry. Another voice answered, deeper and harsher than any human throat could produce. Then came the unmistakable clash of steel striking steel. Grima's face went pale. "The orcs!" Halen rushed toward the nearest window and cautiously looked down into the courtyard. Firelight flickered below, where darkness had ruled only moments before. Torches moved rapidly between the walls, and harsh commands echoed through the fortress. "They're inside," Halen whispered. "More than a dozen." Saruman stepped beside him and looked into the courtyard. Edric's men were emerging from different buildings, some half-armed, others carrying lanterns instead of shields. Confusion spread through their ranks as arrows flew from the shadows. The great gate stood fully open now, and through it poured the scarred orc captain with the rest of his company close behind. The trap had finally sprung. Yet as Saruman watched the battle begin beneath the moonlit walls, he noticed one detail that none of the others had seen. Edric himself was nowhere in sight. The man who knew almost every secret of the fortress had vanished moments before the attack, and Saruman realized with sudden certainty that his former servant had never intended to defend the keep at all. Edric had already gone in search of the hidden vault. The fortress erupted into violence with terrifying speed. Shouts echoed from every courtyard as steel rang against steel beneath the cold moonlight. Torches spun through the darkness, casting wild shadows across ancient walls that had not witnessed battle for generations. Orc war cries rolled through the gate, while frightened horses screamed from the lower stables. Saruman watched only briefly before stepping back from the window, his thoughts already moving beyond the struggle unfolding outside. "Edric planned this," he said quietly. Grima stared at him in disbelief. He cannot have invited orcs into his own camp. "No." Saruman's eyes remained fixed upon the darkness beyond the ruined shelves. But he knew they were coming. Halen turned sharply. "You believe he abandoned his own men?" "I believe," Saruman replied, "that he decided they had become unnecessary." The young ranger's face hardened with anger as understanding slowly dawned upon him. He recalled the hurried meeting in the valley, the strange orders given only hours before the march, and the small groups sent into different wings of the fortress without explanation. Edric had scattered his followers across the keep instead of keeping them together. At the time, it had seemed merely cautious, Now it resembled something far colder. The men who trusted him had become a shield to delay the orcs while he pursued the prize alone. Another crash shook the floor beneath them. Dust drifted from the ceiling as heavy footsteps thundered through the lower hall. The orcs had forced their way into the keep itself. Halen instinctively reached for another arrow, while Grima backed toward the staircase, his breathing growing faster with every passing heartbeat. Saruman remained composed, listening carefully rather than reacting to panic. The battle below was loud, but hidden beneath it he caught another sound. Somewhere within the walls, stone scraped slowly against stone. "The vault has been opened," he murmured. Neither companion understood how he could know, but Saruman had heard that sound before many years earlier. The hidden mechanisms beneath the fortress had been built with immense precision, their counterweights buried deep inside the masonry. Even after decades of silence, they would still produce the same slow grinding whenever the concealed passage moved. Edric had found part of the secret after all. Not enough to uncover the vault alone, but enough to awaken its ancient door. "Come," Saruman said. "There is no more time." They left the ruined archive and hurried downward by a second staircase concealed behind collapsed shelving. Unlike the first, this stair descended beneath the foundations rather than toward the main halls. The air grew colder with every turn, carrying the smell of damp limestone and stagnant water. Moss covered the walls, and tiny streams trickled between ancient blocks laid long before Saruman had ever claimed Isengard. Whoever first built the fortress had understood secrecy as well as strength. The staircase ended before a narrow corridor supported by thick stone arches. Strange carvings decorated the ceiling, worn so smooth that little remained except faint outlines of stars and branching trees. Grima glanced upward uneasily. "These are older than your fortress," he whispered. Saruman nodded once. "Far older. The builders merely expanded what already stood here." He ran one hand across the ancient stone as he passed, recognizing that even his own knowledge of the place had never reached its deepest foundations. Fresh footprints covered the damp floor ahead. Some belonged to Edric and perhaps 2 companions, while others marked the passage of only a single orc. Saruman crouched briefly beside them. The broad prints with sharply cut heels belonged to the scarred captain they had followed across the Wastelands. Somehow he too had discovered the hidden stair without bringing the rest of his company below. 3 hunters had entered the darkness. The others above fought and died, without knowing the true contest had already moved beneath their feet. The corridor widened into a circular chamber, whose walls were lined with empty niches once intended for lamps. Only one still burned, its weak flame casting uncertain light across the floor. Near its center stood a great slab of stone carved with the same symbol they had seen throughout the journey, 3 lines meeting beneath a circle. Yet now the carving was divided cleanly down the middle. The slab had shifted several feet aside, revealing a black opening descending still deeper into the earth. Halen stepped toward it, but suddenly halted. "There is blood." A dark trail stained the edge of the opening before continuing down the hidden stair beyond. Saruman knelt beside it. The blood remained wet. A struggle had taken place only minutes earlier. Beside the stain lay a broken dagger bearing Edric's own maker's mark engraved upon the hilt. Several feet away rested the severed strap of an orc shield. Neither corpse remained. "They found each other," Saruman said. And neither walked away untouched. Without another word, he descended through the opening. The stair beneath was narrow enough that only one person could climb or descend at a time. The walls pressed close on either side, their rough surfaces untouched by later builders. Far below, faint light flickered uncertainly, accompanied by distant voices too muffled to distinguish. Grima swallowed hard, but followed, with Halen bringing up the rear, bow already strung despite the confined space. The hidden stair ended before a vaulted chamber unlike any other in the fortress. The ceiling rose high above, supported by massive square pillars carved directly from the living rock. Iron braziers burned along the walls, their flames revealing shelves filled not with treasure, but with sealed wooden chests, bundles of rolled parchment, and rows of iron cylinders carefully stacked upon stone racks. Dust covered many of them, yet the chamber itself remained remarkably dry. It had been built not to protect gold, but memory. Near the center of the vault stood Edric. His left arm hung useless at his side, dark with blood where an orc blade had cut through leather and flesh. In his uninjured hand, he clutched a thick leather ledger bound with iron clasps. Several loose pages lay scattered around his feet, disturbed during the struggle. Across the chamber, leaning heavily against one of the great pillars, stood the scarred orc captain. Blood streamed from a wound across his ribs, yet the cruel smile had not left his face. A heavy axe rested in his hands, and between the two enemies, the stone floor was marked by fresh blood from them both. Neither man noticed the newcomers at first. Their eyes remained fixed upon the ledger. Edric spoke through clenched teeth. "You are too late." The orc captain answered in broken Western. "No." He tightened his grip upon the axe. "We are exactly on time." Only then did both men turn and see Saruman standing quietly at the entrance to the vault. For the first time since the war had ended, complete silence settled over every living soul in the chamber. Each of them understood that the true master of the hidden records had finally arrived, and whatever happened next would decide far more than possession of a forgotten fortress. No one moved for several long heartbeats. The flames in the iron braziers crackled softly, their light wavering across faces hardened by exhaustion, ambition, and old resentment. Edric stood with the ledger pressed tightly against his chest, his wounded arm hanging uselessly at his side, while the scarred orc captain rested his weight upon one leg to hide the weakness creeping through his injured body. Grima remained near the entrance, unable to decide whether fear or hope held him more firmly. Halen kept his bow half raised, yet the narrow chamber offered no clear shot without risking everyone standing before him. Saruman slowly descended the last steps into the vault without reaching for any weapon. His empty hands contrasted strangely with the tension filling the chamber. Once, his mere presence would have commanded obedience from men and terror from orcs alike. Those days had passed, yet habit still lingered in the minds of those who had once served greater powers. Even the orc captain watched him with wary respect instead of immediate violence, recognizing something of the ancient authority that still clung to the fallen wizard, despite all that had been lost. "You have searched well," Saruman said, his voice calm and measured. "But neither of you understands what you have found." His gaze settled upon the heavy ledger. Those names were never intended to create kingdoms. They were written to preserve silence. Edric laughed once, though pain quickly stole the strength from the sound. "Silence," he replied. "Those names are worth armies. Every village headman, every merchant, every messenger who bent the knee to Isengard. With this book, I could rebuild everything that was lost." The scarred orc captain bared his yellowed teeth in a grim smile. "Man dreams," he growled in broken Western. "Orcs take." He shifted his grip upon the axe, preparing to lunge despite the blood soaking his side. Saruman regarded him without fear. "You would find little loyalty among men," he said. "They obey only while victory smiles upon them." The orc answered with a low growl. "Then I make victory." Edric's patience finally broke. With a sharp cry, he snatched a loose parchment from the floor and hurled it toward the nearest brazier. Halen shouted in alarm, believing the precious record's about to burn, but the page fluttered harmlessly aside before reaching the fire. The movement was enough. The orc captain surged forward with surprising speed, swinging his axe in a brutal arc. Edric stumbled backward, barely avoiding the blow, and the ledger slipped from his grasp onto the stone floor between them. The chamber exploded into motion. Halen loosed an arrow that struck the orc captain high in the shoulder, driving him sideways but failing to stop his charge. Grima darted instinctively toward the fallen ledger, only to freeze as the orc wheeled toward him, with murder blazing in his eyes. Saruman seized a heavy iron cylinder from a nearby shelf and thrust it into the path of the swinging axe. Metal crashed against metal with a deafening clang, the force twisting the weapon from the orc's wounded hands. The axe spun across the chamber, striking a pillar before clattering uselessly to the ground. Edric threw himself toward the ledger once more, but the scarred captain caught him around the waist. Both men crashed against the central stone table, overturning stacks of ancient documents that scattered across the floor like leaves in a storm. They grappled in desperate silence, neither possessing the strength for elegant swordplay after blood loss and exhaustion. The orc's raw power slowly forced Edric backward, despite his frantic resistance. Then, with one final violent effort, Edric drove the broken hilt of his dagger into the orc's throat. The captain staggered away, dropping to one knee while dark blood poured between his fingers. Yet even dying, he refused surrender. His free hand found a discarded spear lying beside one of the shelves. With a final roar, he hurled it across the chamber. The spear missed Edric entirely. Instead, it struck the base of a burning brazier, toppling the heavy iron stand onto the floor. Glowing coals burst across scattered parchments and dry wooden chests. Within moments, thin flames raced greedily through papers that had lain undisturbed for decades. "The fire!" Halen cried. Smoke curled upward with frightening speed. Saruman stared not at the spreading flames, but at the ledger lying only a few steps away. Years of careful secrecy, countless bargains, hidden alliances, and patient manipulation rested within those iron clasps. The book represented the last surviving thread connecting him to the influence he had once wielded across wide regions of Middle-earth. He could almost feel its weight before his hands had even touched it. Every instinct urged him to seize it before the flames claimed what remained of his life's work. Edric reached it first. He struggled to his feet, clutching the ledger against his chest while coughing through thickening smoke. His face no longer showed triumph. Instead, it revealed the desperate understanding that no future remained unless he escaped immediately. He staggered toward a narrow side passage leading away from the vault. Before he had taken 3 steps, Saruman spoke a single sentence. "You cannot read it." Edric stopped. Slowly he turned. "What?" "The names are not written." Saruman's voice remained steady despite the smoke filling the chamber. "They are hidden." Confusion spread across Edric's face. He tore open the ledger and stared wildly at the pages. Instead of names, he found columns of symbols, numbers, and meaningless phrases scattered across every sheet. He turned page after page with growing disbelief. Nothing resembled the list he had expected. "The key," Saruman said quietly, "was never kept here." Edric's hands began to tremble. "You lied to all of us." "I trusted no one completely." The words struck Edric harder than any blade could have done. Years of searching, betrayal, and bloodshed had led him to a book he could not use. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of that realization. Before another word could be spoken, a burning beam crashed from the ceiling between him and the others. Sparks erupted in every direction, and flames surged across the floor with terrifying force. The wounded orc captain gave one final rasping laugh before collapsing beside the fallen brazier, his strength spent at last. Halen seized Grimmer by the arm and dragged him away from the spreading fire. Saruman remained motionless for only a heartbeat longer, watching the coded ledger vanish behind a curtain of flame. He understood with perfect clarity that he alone still possessed the knowledge needed to read it. Yet he also knew there was no path through the inferno that would not end in death. At last he turned away. The 4 survivors fled through the smoke-filled passage as the ancient vault groaned around them. Behind them, shelves crashed one after another beneath growing flames, and the carefully preserved records of Isengard disappeared into fire and ash. By the time they reached the hidden stair, thick black smoke was pouring through every chamber below the fortress. The secret Saruman had guarded for so many years was dying behind him, consumed not by enemies alone, but by the ambitions of those who had once served him most faithfully. The smoke pursued them through the hidden passages like a living thing. Every breath burned Grimmer's throat, and the stone beneath their feet trembled as heavy beams collapsed somewhere deep within the fortress. Halen led the way up the narrow stair, remembering every turn he had passed only a short while before, while Saruman followed at a measured pace despite the chaos surrounding them. He neither hurried nor looked back. The vault was already beyond saving, and he knew that panic had claimed more lives than fire ever would. They emerged into the lower halls of the keep to find the battle still raging above. Orcs and men stumbled through smoke-filled corridors, no longer fighting in disciplined ranks, but in scattered pockets of desperate violence. Flames had climbed into the timber galleries, filling the ancient hall with showers of glowing embers. A wounded orc burst through a doorway, clutching a stolen chest, only to collapse beneath the sword of one of Edric's followers, before either noticed the burning ceiling descending upon them. The fortress had ceased to belong to either side. It now belonged to the fire. Saruman guided his companions away from the fighting, through forgotten service passages, known only to those who had once maintained the hidden stronghold. The narrow corridors twisted between the outer walls until they reached a small postern gate concealed behind thick ivy. Rust resisted the ancient lock for several moments before yielding with a dull crack. Cold night air rushed inside, carrying the clean scent of mountain wind that seemed almost unreal after the choking smoke. One by one, they stepped out onto a narrow ledge overlooking the northern cliffs. Behind them, the fortress groaned like a wounded beast. Flames burst through shattered windows, climbing into the darkness as towers of sparks drifted toward the stars. The great keep, silent for decades, had awakened only to destroy itself within a single night. From the courtyard came fading cries of men calling to one another, answered by the harsh shouts of orcs equally desperate to escape. Then a section of the southern wall collapsed with a roar that echoed across the mountains, sending a cloud of dust rolling into the valleys below. They descended the cliff path carefully, saying little until the fortress stood well behind them. At the foot of the mountain, they finally stopped beside a stream flowing through a stand of ash trees. Dawn had begun to pale the eastern sky, though smoke still drifted above the heights, where the ruined stronghold burned. Halen washed soot and blood from his face before turning towards Saruman. Weariness filled his eyes, yet there was something else as well. It was the expression of a man who had watched an old dream die. "So it is finished," Halen said quietly. Saruman regarded the distant smoke for a long moment before answering. "No." Halen frowned. "The records are gone." The records were never the true power. Grima looked sharply toward his master. "You said only you could read them." "I could." Saruman's voice remained calm. "And now no one ever shall." He offered no satisfaction in those words. The destruction of the ledger had denied victory to every rival, yet it had also severed the last thread connecting him to the secret network he had spent years weaving across the southern lands. His careful designs had not been stolen. They had simply ceased to exist. Halen rested both hands upon his bow. "What will you do now?" he asked. "The men who followed Edric are scattered. The orcs are broken. There is nothing left to rebuild here." Saruman did not answer immediately. Instead, he knelt beside the stream and rinsed soot from his weathered hands. The cold water carried black ash away without effort, leaving only pale skin beneath. He watched the dark current disappear downstream before finally rising. "There are always places overlooked by the powerful," he said. "Great kingdoms concern themselves with great victories. They seldom notice small roads, quiet villages, or the grievances of ordinary folk." Grima lowered his eyes. He had heard that tone before. It was the voice Saruman used whenever one design had failed and another quietly began to take shape. They resumed their journey after sunrise, leaving the smoking mountains behind. Halen traveled with them only until midday, when the road divided near the edge of the Wastelands. He stopped there, looking first toward the north and then back toward the distant plume of smoke rising above the ruined fortress. "I have no wish to serve another master," he said. "Too many good men died following those who desired more than they needed." Saruman inclined his head slightly, neither mocking nor persuading him. "Then choose your own road," he replied. "Few are granted that freedom." Without another word, Halen turned west and disappeared into the rolling hills. Grima watched him go until the solitary figure vanished beyond the horizon. For the first time in many years, he envied another man. Halen carried little besides his bow and the clothes upon his back, yet he walked without fear of the past, following close behind. Grima, by contrast, found himself unable to imagine life apart from the old wizard beside him, even though every step beside Saruman seemed to lead toward fresh misery. Several days later, they reached the southern borders of the lands once guarded by Isengard. The burned fields slowly gave way to greener country, where scattered farms had survived the war through stubborn endurance rather than strength. Smoke rose peacefully from distant cottages, and children could occasionally be seen working beside their families in the fields. Saruman paused upon a ridge overlooking those quiet settlements. No banners flew there, no armies marched. No one knew his name, nor cared about the rise and fall of great lords. A slow, thoughtful smile touched his face. "So much is forgotten," he murmured. Grima felt an uneasiness deeper than anything he had known in the Wastelands. "What are you thinking?" Saruman rested both hands within his sleeves as he gazed northward beyond the fields, beyond the rivers, beyond the long roads leading toward lands untouched by war. "I am thinking," he said softly, "that there remain places where trust is plentiful, watchfulness is scarce, and pride sleeps behind pleasant doors." He turned away from the ridge and began walking. Grima followed because he knew no other path. Behind them, the hidden fortress collapsed at last. Its highest tower broke apart beneath the lingering fire, crashing into the valley in a cloud of ash that scattered upon the wind. The secrets buried there were gone forever, and the Wastelands claimed their silence once again. Ahead lay only long roads and smaller ambitions, but those who understood Saruman's patient mind would have recognized the danger at once. Stripped of armies, deprived of power, and robbed of nearly every servant, he had abandoned the dream of ruling kingdoms. Instead, he sought a humbler prize, one that required no fortress, no forge, and no host of orcs. Step by quiet step, the fallen wizard turned his face toward the distant Shire, where the final chapter of his life still awaited him. If you have walked beside Saruman from the first lonely road beyond Isengard to the last quiet path leading toward the Shire, you have seen that his greatest defeat did not come when his tower fell or when his staff was broken. Those were only outward signs of a loss that had begun much earlier, when wisdom slowly yielded to the desire to command. In Tolkien's world, power is rarely evil because it is strong. It becomes dangerous when it ceases to serve and begins to possess the one who seeks it. Saruman could still remember every hidden road, every secret sign, and every careful plan, yet he had forgotten the one truth that none of those things could preserve a kingdom once trust had been abandoned. That is why every step of his journey through the Wastelands led not toward restoration, but toward a smaller and lonelier ambition. You may notice that the treasures hidden beneath the fortress were never jewels, enchanted weapons, or forgotten crowns. They were names, promises, and memories of quiet bargains made in the shadows. Such things are more fitting for Tolkien's Middle-earth than any vault of gold, because the greatest struggles are often fought through loyalty rather than wealth. The fortress itself became a mirror of Saruman's own life. Its walls remained standing long after the purpose within them had decayed, and when desperate hands finally tore open its deepest chamber, they found only the ashes of a design that had already failed in spirit before it failed in stone. Fire merely revealed what pride had long concealed. Yet this tale also reminds you that evil seldom destroys itself alone. Again and again, those who reached for domination weakened one another through suspicion, greed, and betrayal. Edric believed he could inherit his master's designs. The orc captain believed he could seize them through force. Both mistook possession for mastery, and neither understood the burden carried by the thing they pursued. This quiet pattern appears throughout Tolkien's legendarium. Darkness often consumes its own servants because it cannot build lasting fellowship, while even the smallest acts of simple loyalty endure longer than the grandest schemes founded upon fear. You have also walked beside Grima, whose road is perhaps the saddest of all. He was neither hero nor conqueror, but a man who had surrendered his own will piece by piece until he scarcely remembered how to choose another path. More than once, freedom stood before him, and yet habit proved stronger than hope. Tolkien often shows that pity is offered far more often than it is accepted, and that mercy cannot save the one who refuses to step toward it. Grima's tragedy lies not only in the master he followed, but in the quiet conviction that he could no longer become anyone else. At the end, Saruman leaves the ashes behind and turns toward peaceful lands where ordinary people know little of the games of mighty rulers. That ending belongs naturally within Tolkien's world, for great wars do not conclude every story. Shadows linger after victories, and the hearts of the proud seldom surrender as quickly as their armies. Yet beyond those lingering shadows stands another truth. The fields continue to grow, rivers continue to flow, simple folk continue to plant, mend, laugh, and welcome one another beneath quiet roofs. As you leave these wastelands behind, remember the first lonely road where two weary figures walked through the silence of a fallen realm. The wind still carries ash across those forgotten stones, but beyond it, unseen by the proud, green grass has already begun to return.